Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is the Skyjiro Ancient Iron Warrior Katana. Before I get into the review, a couple disclaimers, if you will. First, this is a review sample sent to me from Skyjiro. I have to return this review sample, so I might not be destroying it. It's not mine to keep, but I didn't spend any money on it. So if you think that makes me biased or affects me in some way, then you know at the start. The other bit to note is that I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship, but I'm not an authority figure on it. I'm not particularly good at it even, but I'm trying. And so keep that context in mind as you hear my musings and ramblings on this particular sword. About this sword, it is about $400, $389 on the Skyjiro website. It may be more or less if it's through some other distributor, but that's what it says on their website right now. It has a list of features and specifications and all that, and I'll put that in the description down below. The price point, I'm going to kind of think about it as a mid-range sword, and I'm going to compare it, or rather try to think about the other swords that I've had that are around the $400 mark and how this stacks up against them, but I'll put that at the end of the review when I give you my thoughts and opinions on it. And this review as well is not really to sell you on anything. I'm just showing you high-res video, photos. I'm moving it around, and you can hopefully garner some information on that. Make up your own mind about if it's worth your $389 yourself. Anyway, with that context in mind, I'm going to jump into it. As I do, I start my reviews at the kashra, the end, the pommel, work my way down, and that's what we'll do here. So the Iron Warrior from Skyjiro doesn't have a particularly elaborate set of fittings on it. They're simple, but I actually really like the touches here. They're relatively, they have some rims on them and some definition to them, but overall just a simple patinaed cast kashra here, but also one that I don't see everywhere else. So there's fittings that are on a lot of Chinese-made style swords that you see on eBay and on from a lot of different manufacturers like Jaco and Ryan Sword. And no disrespect to any of those companies, but they don't have particularly unique feeling fittings because they kind of draw from the same parts bins, if you will. Skyjiro seems to have some different fittings which are a little bit more bespoke to them and give them kind of a unique look and feel. Even if some of it is similar to other fittings, they are at least a little bit unique. And this is not necessarily an exception. It doesn't have a shitodome, but it does have a little kind of groove cut in around the area where the shitodome would be. And yeah, it's simple, but it looks nice, and it's not something that I've seen on a bunch of other swords. I could be wrong about that, of course, but it's not one that bears resemblance to other swords that I have seen. So I like that. I like that aspect of uniqueness. At least it's not on thousands of other katanas, or maybe it is, but not not as many as if it was drawing from the kind of standard parts bin, if you will. Shape-wise on the kashra, though, I like, obviously, design. It's got a nice patina on it. I haven't found that the patina has really worn off, but I do have some concerns that may be the case. I haven't used this very much to this point. I've had this sword roughly a month, maybe a little bit less than that, but I've used it relatively extensively for Iaido and class, and I've brought it around and practiced with it quite a bit. And in that time, I do see that the patina is starting to wear just a little bit on the fitting. So this nice kind of blued or grayed look might not be forever, but that's, again, very common on fittings. A lot of the patina are not particularly durable and will wear off if you're using them extensively. I don't see a lot of problems after a month, but I do think it will eventually wear off, at least if you're using it quite a bit. Transitions, it butts up nice, but it has some weird little bulge kind of down here that's unsightly. For a $400 sword, though, not a huge problem. It's not stacked over or done particularly badly. It's more of an unsightly thing as opposed to anything bad. But it's perfectly acceptable for that $400 range. It's on there tight. It hasn't wiggled around or moved. These ledges on here are also, they're not sharp, but they do come to a more acute point than what might be comfortable, and I find that when I swing it around, it pushes into my hand, and I certainly feel it, but it's not as uncomfortable as some sorts, I suppose I'll say. But this particular model has ledges on it. None of them are sharp. They're all chamfered, but by design, this has kind of a right angle to it that can rub in the flub of your hand. Anyway, that's a lot of talking for the kashra, but it's on there, it's good, and it represents something that flows thematically through the rest of the stuff there, through the rest of the sword, I should say. This Iron Warrior simple fittings kind of flows around. But I'll move up to the ska, the handle, the grip right here. And first, the thing I like to point out is that this Ito is not as tight as it could be. It could be tighter. Custom wraps that cost as much as the sword does in its entirety would be tighter. But for a mass production sword, this is among the tighter. It's one of the tighter Itos that I have felt. I still, with pressure, can move the knots. And so sometimes folks will ask me, well, what's loose and what's tight? Well, with a little bit of pressure, if I can freely move the diamonds around, then that's kind of medium. And I for high-end sword practitioners or people that are really particular about it, there should be no movement. The expectation is that with pressure, if you're moving it, pushing on it with your thumb with a good amount of pressure, that the knots don't move at all. There's no movement in the ito whatsoever. And so that's the expectation. Going down from that's never met really in mass production swords or most production pieces. It does sometimes happen in really high-end swords, but not typically on anything $400. This is on par with what I saw from the Huawei piece and other Skyjiro swords. It's very, very good though. It doesn't move around much if I push on it relatively hard. Bad would be an example where if I push on it, it moves around somewhat freely on the knots. Really bad would be if I can go on these flats right here and push them around with my fingers and they move up and down the scud, and that's really loose and it's not going to last. Not probably going to last more than a session or two in training, and it makes it feel slippery and loose in your hand if the ito is loose. There's an expectation of tightness that aids in how secure it feels in your hand. If the ito's moving around, it's hard to feel like you have good purchase and are in control of the weapon, which with a 4-foot razor blade is important. Anyway, this is tight. That's a really long-winded way of saying that, but it's as tight as I would expect. I would call it good for a sword in this price point. The diamonds wander around a little bit in size and scale, but overall I would say also pretty good. And it has a reasonable kind of wasted-looking shape to it that I find appealing, in especially a sword in this price point. It's also not too big shape-wise, so it's relatively compact. A lot of times these handles get overbuilt. Sometimes people prefer that. I happen to prefer something a little bit more slender, despite my the size of my hands might indicate that I would like something else, but I do prefer this a little bit more slender grip. It's got brown silk on it. There's some mild fraying that's happened on here. Not a lot, not terribly problematic, but might be a disappointment to some folks to see little strands kind of pop up here and there, but not particularly anything that I'm overly concerned about. The Samegawa panels are small nodules underneath that have also been lacquered gray by the look of it, and overall I think it makes a handsome grip. I'm not usually a huge fan of brown on brown, but that's an aesthetic thing. Overall, this seems reasonably well done. The gold Manuki on here do really draw my eye though, so one aesthetic thing that I happen to like, and it's purely subjective, is to not have anything that my eye just is instantly drawn to. And by having these kind of more subtle, darker blackened fittings here, darker brown ito, darker brown Samegawa, and then bright gold Manuki, those Manuki pull my eye in, and aesthetically not a huge fan of that aspect, but that's a small thing. I don't think it balances particularly well. It's just one spot. I can also notice some brass from the Seppa, but that doesn't pull my eye in the same way. My eye usually just goes right to the Manuki. Anyway, speaking of Manuki, casting quality is meh on them. I can make out some detail. I think they're a dragon or some such thing, but overall there's nothing particularly fancy about the Manuki. If I move up to the Fuchi right here, there is a little bit of overlap, a little bit of transition. I didn't find it uncomfortable on my hand though. It's rounded enough and there's not any sharp casting bits left over, but there is some kind of overlap. The Fuchi's a little bit oversized for where it's supposed to meet the handle here. Alternatively though, it's aesthetically even anyway, and I've seen this done poorly on some. This transition for whatever reason doesn't really bother me all that much. And as I move my fingers around on it, I can't peel my nail around on it. I can't really get a fingernail on it easily. The theme of the Fuchi, very similar to the Kashra, has some slight recesses or grooves in it. Give it a little bit of character, but it's relatively simple, and it has the same kind of patina or bluing effect on it. I like the transition between the Fuchi and the Tsuba. There's a slight step. It's not perfectly flat, but overall, I like the transition. It doesn't jar me or seem astray at all. I happen to like the transition, again, especially in a sword of this price point. It's very easy to have the Fuchi too small and then have this Koiguchi area really big, and there's this kind of jarring transition. I don't see that here. It seems to blend pretty well, again, for a sword in this price point, or really for any sword. It does transition a little differently from one end to the other. There's maybe a millimeter of difference on the Ha side or the edge side versus the back, but overall, not bad, and I don't know that it's a point that a lot of people really care about anyway. If I talk about the Tsuba, there's a name for this style of Tsuba, and honestly, I can't remember what it is, but it looks like it's going to pull my fingernails. I'm always nervous when I see these large gaps and little flaps and things like this on Tsuba, because if I'm swinging it around and actually swinging with commitment and purchase, my finger might ride up or twist, and I'm always nervous I'm gonna hurt myself with them. But I haven't had that experience. I've used this quite a bit over the last month or so, and yeah, it's comfortable. It's handsome. I can't remember again the name, but there's little details on the tsuba apart from the patina on it that matches the Fujikashira. There's a little recessed area down here and on the opposite side, and then the cutout areas add some effect. Again, I can't recall exactly what the name of this style is, but it's appealing, and it's got little something that makes it not perfectly spherical. I can't remember what these notches are called. Anyway, a handsome overall looking fitting, and I like the tsuba. It doesn't have any depth, so a raised rim or a slightly swelled center that tapers down might be appealing, but overall, for what I'd normally expect in this price point, this is meeting or exceeding the expectation. And thematically, apart from my eye being drawn to Manuki, I think that the handle overall is handsome and feels really pretty good in the hand. Again, I like the cylindrical kind of thing. It's got some slight bumps here or there, and I might be able to make out the line where the panel is. All of that is really par for the course in a sword at this price point. It's comfortable though. The Ito didn't move and nothing wore away, so hilt-wise, I'm a fan. If I move down to the Habaki, the Skyjiro pieces have this little crossed feather Habaki, and I like it. It's a simple brass Habaki that's pretty much the same as everything else, but by putting in that Skyjiro branding Mon thing, it tells you what manufacturer the sword is, and it's just a little different. It adds some texture and flavor that I happen to like. Fit of the Habaki, apart from it being brass and has the cross feathers, it fits about the same. The Munmachi area overlaps a little bit. It's not as good as it could be. It's really par for the course fit-wise on the actual blade for a $400 sword. There's things that are a deviation from maybe the expectation or perfection, but in the $400 sword price point, this is perfectly acceptable. How it fits in the saya, though, is an important thing. So one, it really, tension-wise, fits pretty good. It doesn't fall out. Push my thumb, maybe a little tense, but this will wear away with time. It was tighter when I got it as well, but it overall is really a snug fit. I didn't have to do any shimming. It was ready to use as a training tool out of the box. Doesn't fall out when it's upside down. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that right around here, just a little bit before the Habaki touches the Koiguchi area, there's a little bit of a bind in the saya, and so I feel it kind of snag and give tension here. It's a very nuanced, small thing, a particular thing to call out, but it does have a little bit of binding in there. That's about it, though. It doesn't really deter me very much from using it. I notice it a little bit when I'm putting the sword away, but not terribly. It's just worth noting that it's not perfect, but it's really quite good. Apart from that, it's worth noting that the sword really goes in pretty well. It's not raspy, and when I get the sword in, it's very hard for me to put it in the wrong way in such a way that it binds somewhere else in the saya or cuts into the scabbard in some way. So the cutout in here allows it to be a pretty functional training tool. When it's fully secured, really no rattle at all, but I think that's because there's some tension down here holding it in, which provides the effect of no rattle, but also gives a strange sensation when you're doing noto and putting it away. Moving on to the saya. Again, I talked about the fit up here, which is important. It's a gloss black saya that I don't really see much of any issue with, but nothing that really stands out. The fit is good. The lacquer seems good. I do see ripples in it. It's not perfectly flat. It has the slightest of tapers, which honestly actually isn't a thing that's appreciable. Very rarely in mass production swords in the $400 price point is the saya anything other than one kind of a one-dimensional tube. Here it does taper down just a little bit towards the kojiri, the end here, and that's nice. I didn't actually notice that in using it, but it does have a slight taper to it, so I like that. Lacquer has, again, some surface ripples. It's a black gloss saya and came overall in pretty good shape. I think there were some small white spots, but what I didn't notice on here is also important. So when I untied the sageo here, I didn't see any lacquer spots where the sageo was tied on before it was dry. So there weren't really any noticeable imperfections or problems with the scabbard, which is also worth noting because that is very common in swords at this price point. I believe there's horn underneath here on the kojiri. I could be wrong. I believe there's horn at the koiguchi, and this kurigata area I believe is also made of wood. I could be wrong. It's tough to see. It's lacquered over. I can make out a koiguchi here, and I can kind of see it as well. Incidentally, the koiguchi is finished reasonably well for a sword in this price point. think it's overall reasonably well done. I think there's also horn kojiri, but I'm not sure it's painted over, and I don't want to whack into it too much. I also want to say one thing I noticed when I took the sword out of the box is that it didn't have shirodome. That's not, in this case, I think, bad, and a great way to save money, even if it's a few cents, because these shirodome that go on the kurigata often just come loose. They're not glued in. They bind on the saya and don't feel good and are a pain in the butt if you actually use the thing. So by not putting them on there, it saves me the trouble of taking them off and the frustration of having to deal with it. The sageo that it came with is decent, matches the color Ito-wise, but it has little frays and stuff. I haven't used this very much, but there's little bits that have kind of come undone. So not a particularly high quality piece, it seems, but overall handsome enough, does the job. Haven't had any particular problem with it. It was long enough as well to use for either a style of martial art that I practice swordsmanship-wise. The last bit is probably the most important, the pointy stabby part, the thing that people are maybe most interested in. Again, dimensions I will put in the description down below. They should all be there. If you're keen on that kind of thing, that's where you'll find them. Sword. So it has a nice gentle Sori that flows throughout the blade. It does straighten out a little bit handle-wise and then start curving, but it's mostly towards the center. It has a slight taper in profile here. Not a lot of distal taper, but a little bit. Again, what you can't necessarily see in the camera will hopefully come through when I give you the measurements later on. This sword, I believe, I can't tell honestly if it's got a differential hardened blade or a through hardened blade. I believe it is a folded blade that is through hardened, because I don't see any distinguishable hamon, and it also differs a little bit from what I see on the Skyjiro website. So I make out the folded pattern on here, and it's subtle, but it certainly comes out if you have the right light for it. But I don't see any sign of a hamon, so I believe this is a through hardened blade. At least that's what I'm going to speculate. Polish wise, the blade, at least in terms of the planes, are really clean and flat. I see some rippling along the Mune, which isn't uncommon, and the Shinogi G and Shinogi area are subtle, like it's gone under a buffing wheel or something. It's not a particularly crisp or elegant polish, but again, $400, that's not the expectation. The idea that the planes are flat, that it glides in and fits the saya well, and that I can make out the folding pattern at all is all I'm really expecting for $400. And there weren't any really abrasive problems or scuffs or problems that came out of the box straight away. It was pretty clean. I believe there were some small smudges, saya rub if you will, where things rubbed on the blade a little bit, but nothing that really stood out as overly problematic or ugly right away. The Kisaki has a geometric profile to it. That's something that some folks care about. Doesn't really matter to me if it does or doesn't, but this particular one, the yokote, actually just above the yokote, there's a pretty steep curve where the Kisaki takes a different profile and shape. So the yokote isn't geometric. It's actually about 1 millimeter above the yokote, but it does have both a yokote and a geometric Kisaki. They just happen to be in slightly different spots, which is odd, but it's not that big a deal. Everything is sharp as well. That's another thing I actually wanted to note. I think the Kisaki is good. The polish meets expectations, and the sharpness level was sufficient to kind of pop noodles apart right away. It cut to tamimets really quite well. It had a sufficient level of sharpness out of the box, which is an important thing. Sometimes swords come dull and you feel like you have to sharpen them before you can use them for tamashigiri, cutting, actually popping noodles apart, and you have to work on the tool before you can use it. If a sword is intended to be used, I want it to be able to pop pool noodles. I want it to be able to do tamashigiri right away. That's an expectation, and it was met here. So kudos to Skyjiro on that one. Dynamics-wise, I have enjoyed using this as a tool for Iaido and practicing. So I'll talk a little bit about the movement now. So movement-wise, I practiced with it for roughly a month, and it's been, frankly, a joy. I really like it as a tool. It draws and sheathes easily. It's not particularly noisy. It's sharp. It's a good size for me. I like the tightness of the Ito. Overall, it's been a really good training tool, and easy to say that if that's your interest, you want a sharp sword and you want it to have some attention to the detail without breaking the bank, this is a reasonable option. Skyjiro seems to have made a pretty good product for somebody that is trying to learn Japanese-style swordsmanship, doing Iaido and the like. Anyway, I practiced with a lot, rain or shine, you might say, and overall the experience was very pleasant. I don't really have anything to critique or complain about based on the sword at this price point. I mentioned the little nuances and things that I liked or didn't like as I was explaining earlier in the review. Training-wise, there wasn't really anything to note or complain about. The Kisaki is really quite sharp, so I did zing myself a couple times doing Noto, but it wasn't so bad, and that was more my fault than the sword's. Beyond that, though, the only thing I could really think of is that the tip isn't reinforced. It could use a slight swelling in the Kisaki. That's something that I don't see on every sword. It's not required in a sword at this price point. But, for example, the Ronin Dojo Pro that I have to review later on has a kind of reinforced Kisaki, and it's something that I like to see. Otherwise, little nuances that often get overlooked. The blade lines up really well with the handle. There's no curves or winds. And those are all important as you're talking about using cutting as a training tool. There's really not much to complain about. Again, for $400. If you're spending $4,000, then there may be some more points to complain about. But for $400, I think they're really doing quite well here. That brings me to the usage side of things. So when I talk about actually cutting things, I did tatami mat first in class. It was really good. My cutting performance wasn't so great, but the sword performed amicably. The first time I cut with it was in front of other people in a class on a used Japanese-style tatami mat, and it did really quite well. I didn't notice the sword being problematic. My angles were bad, but the tool is really actually quite effective at doing that kind of stuff. It's not the same thing as using a performance-built tamashigiri blade like a Practical XL or something like that. It doesn't pop through the mats the same way. It could be even a little bit sharper, but I had no problem with using it for tamashigiri. It did really quite well. The cuts were clean, and the only issues I could complain about were my own technique. Cutting water bottles, though, is a little bit different. So this, I did cut some water bottles, and I didn't do a whole lot of them. These were just water bottles in the backyard. And what I've noticed are two very, very minor edge deflection. It's very faint. It's tough to see. But in the right light, you can kind of see just two minor little blips on the blade, and it looks like from near where the plastic was thick around not the cap or the neck of the bottle, but maybe from around that. But when I cut the water bottle, I got some very slight edge deflection on the finer points of the edge here. It doesn't look like it's chipped. It didn't impact cutting any other bottles, didn't notice any problems, and as I run my fingernail around them, they're almost tough to feel. Like I can still certainly cut myself with this sword, so I'm going to stop doing that. But the point is that there was some very, very minor edge deflection from cutting the thicker part of a bottle. That's a little bit disappointing. It's not necessarily the worst or unexpected, and I am cutting with this on a colder day. Sometimes that has an impact on performance, though it wasn't so cold that I would have expected deformation on the blade from cutting a water bottle. It's worth noting, though, that other blades have had that issue. It's just good when it doesn't. So maybe it's a little bit on the softer side of through hardening. Tough to say, but when I cut a water bottle, there was very, very, very minor damage from doing that. No damage from the tatami mat apart from the typical scratches that get left behind after you're cutting anything. On the finer points of the edge, though, it's less than a millimeter, but it's there, and so it's worth noting. Anyway, I believe, again, it was from the thicker part of a water bottle. I've had other swords that do that, usually very refined edges that aren't reinforced. They excel at tamashigiri, but they don't do so well at water bottle cutting. Water bottles, though, are a light target. Pool noodles as well, I would say it popped those apart really easy. It was effortless to cut pool noodles with, and that means it's got a nice keen edge. But that keen edge, it seems, comes at a cost here, where it's not going to be the most durable cutter, and it's not intended to be. Skyjiro kind of positions themselves as tools for practitioners. This one, if you're doing tamashigiri, I noticed no problems, and I cut a big, thick, used Japanese tatami mat, and those things can be tough on a sword. No bends, no issues, and my cuts weren't great. But on a bottle, maybe it's not the best sword for those targets, at least if you're cutting the thicker ones. All right, sword friends, hopefully what I've shared with you at this point gives you enough information to make up your own mind. I've showed high-res images, I've babbled on about little details for probably way longer than I should have, and you've seen me cut with it for what that's worth. So hopefully that's enough for you to make up your own mind about if it's worth your $389 or not. But I also need to answer that question. Is it worth the $389? Would I recommend it? And short answer is yes. In particular, if you're a Japanese swordsmanship practitioner, this is a great option. This and the Huawei blade for around $400 were really, very equivalent to one another and addressed a lot of the same things. The Ito was tight. The fittings are a little bit more bespoke in the Skyjiro than the Huawei piece. The polish was reasonable as a training tool. It was really fun to work with, really good. And some of those little nuances were just addressed in ways that other competitors around $400 don't seem to address them. So I think if you are in particular a practitioner of Japanese swordsmanship, there's a lot to be appreciated here. If you're cutting tatami, it seemed to do that really well. It wouldn't be my first choice for only a tatami blade, but if you're mixing Yaido and Tamashigiri and you want something that maybe has a shape or color or something about this style that you like, then it did that activity reasonably well too. Where it loses me a little bit is on the resilience. So obviously it took some, even very small edge deflection or deformation from a water bottle. And that's a deal breaker for a number of the people watching here. So if you are one of those folks and you favor resilience over some of the fit and finish benefits that this offers, then it's not the blade for you. Well, I would say that the deflection issues that I've seen on this happened on other swords that were much more expensive. Again, regardless of what I say, any damage from a water bottle is just not gonna be acceptable to a number of people. I would say that it's not a deal breaker for me. This is a blade more designed for Tamashigiri and Yaido, and it did those things well without issue. I could have used Japanese tatami mat, which is not a slouch of a target either, and there were no bends, no edge deflection, no issues, and it seemed as sharp as it was, even though I only cut one mat, so it should be. But it did that fine. Cutting into the neck of a water bottle, though, it took some edge damage, and if that's concerning to you, then this is not the right one. Incidentally, it is a through-hardened blade, so it's one of the pieces that Skyjiro makes that's supposed to potentially be a little bit more on the resilient side, and it still just doesn't have the edge reinforcement to do that. So something a little thicker, a little bit more robust would maybe be better for that type of target cutting. Anyway, those are my thoughts. It does get a yes from me. I would exercise some caution in buying from Skyjiro, though. I've heard some complaints from people recently that say if they're doing a special order or something that's not in stock, it's taking longer than expected. I don't personally think that they're out to get you or anything. If I did, I wouldn't be making the video. But I would buy what's in stock if you're not abundant with your patience, because people have said that what should take a few months is taking a year or more, and maybe that's because of all the supply chain challenges right now. I'm not exactly sure, but if you do see something in stock somewhere and it is a Skyjiro blade, hopefully this gives you some idea of the build quality. And if they're offering this level of build quality for this price, then I would say yes, it is worth it in my book. Just again, do so with that little nuance in mind that a custom order may take much longer than expected. Though again, that is not that uncommon in the sword market at this time. So anyway, thanks again to Skyjiro for sending me the sword. It's much appreciated. Hopefully it's been helpful to you out there. As always, cheers and thanks for watching.